January is National Cervical Cancer Awareness Month. Cervical cancer is one of the most preventable cancers, but millions of women across the globe develop the disease and die from it because of a lack of symptoms and access to regular checkups. We're joined by Dr. Mamta Singhvi, a radiation oncologist and assistant professor at UC Riverside in Southern California. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Layla, for having me here.
So cervical cancer, which I think a lot of people do not realize, is quite preventable. Can you tell us why the spotlight isn't on cervical cancer as much as it is on other cancers?
Absolutely. So I want to make clear that it is a very deadly cancer globally. It's the second most prevalent cause of cancer death in women. I think the difference being is that today in this country, in the United States, it's more of a cancer of the kind of minority, uneducated. Poverty is a huge risk factor. And so why did that change? Because at the turn of the century in the United States, cervical cancer was the #1 killer of women. Because we suddenly had access to this public health godsend in the Pap smear, death plummeted. And so you have pockets in this country where women don't have access or the knowledge or the awareness of how to get to these kind of preventive tools, and those are the women being affected. Globally, it's countries like India, sub-Saharan Africa, where it is the #1 killer of women because there's just not, even if there's knowledge, there's not access to those tools.
What causes cervical cancer?
So the vast majority, I'm talking at least 95% up of cases, are secondary to human papillomavirus or HPV. And one of the exciting things about cervical cancer is that it's a naturally slow progression. So women tend to get HPV, and it's very common. I want to make that clear from the get-go that HPV is the most common sexually transmitted illness. We got to normalize the stigma around it. We have to be able to discuss it because it's killing people. And so you don't want to, that's another reason that we don't discuss cervical cancers, because of the sexual stigma, the taboo around it. So HPV usually is picked up in teenage years, but it takes at least 10 to 15 years for that HPV to be asymptomatic and slowly, in some women, develop into precancer and then frank cancer.
Are there certain strains of HPV that don't take as long to develop precancers?
I wouldn't necessarily say that. I would say that that's a great question, and that there's dozens and dozens of strains. There are in this country a few that are most common in terms of leading to cancer, and those include 16 and 18. And when we look at the vaccine, that covers the vast majority of strains that go on to lead to cancer.
And with the vaccine, so there was some controversy when the vaccine first came out, whether or not parents should have their children, both male and female, vaccinated for this virus. So where are we today with that?
So, HPV, and that's something that, again, is a great point that you bring up. It's not just women that need to be protected, because HPV goes on to cause actually a lot of cancers. Anal cancer, certain types of oropharyngeal cancer, vulvar cancer, vaginal cancer, penile cancer. And what we're seeing is that the vaccine actually protects against all of these different malignancies. So that's really exciting. You're also bang on when you say that HPV vaccine was really controversial in the rollout in this country. Mostly, I would say, again, we come back to why would a parent who has a 12 or 14-year-old child or a 10-year-old child, when the doctor says, hey, it's a sexually transmitted illness, your kid needs to be vaccinated, it's only natural that parent would say, hey, that's a bit too early. I don't want to broach those conversations with my child. But I think what we need to do is remove kind of the stigma, the taboo, that piece of conversation, and just say, hey, cervical cancer kills. It's a very deadly cancer. We have a tool to prevent it in this vaccine. Let's go in and across the board do what we can to protect our children in the next generation.
Can adults be vaccinated?
So again, a great question. The vaccine is ideally given to people pre any sort of sexual engagement. So that's why the guess is that 10 to 12-year-old kids is kind of the perfect age. One, their immune system is most robust, so it's able to mount that response to the vaccine. And also it's before ideally any sort of exposure to that sexually transmitted illness. So yes, it is actually approved up until actually 46 years old, but the effectiveness of the vaccine really wanes once anyone starts to engage in any sort of sexual activity. Ideally, you're giving it to people before they have any sort of exposure to any HPV virus.
I see. All right. Well, this is a good place to take a break. When we come back, I want to hear a little bit more about what the process is to find out whether or not you have HPV, not something to be afraid of, but what to expect for a patient who may find themselves diagnosed. So we're going to do that after the commercial. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. January is National Cervical Cancer Awareness Month, and we've been chatting with Dr. Mamta Singhvi. She's a radiation oncologist and assistant professor at UC Riverside in Southern California. And cervical cancer, one of the most common cancers among women across the world. It is also one of the most preventable, but unfortunately millions of women die because of a lack of access, it sounds like, to medical care. So, doctor, let's just say that someone finds himself able to go to the doctor for a regular checkup. So you say that through a pap smear, they can discover whether or not they've been infected with HPV. What is the next step for them?
So guidelines have actually rapidly changed over the last few years in terms of screening. So this is, when we say pap smear, that's a screening method to ideally pick up any sort of cancer at an early stage. And I want to make clear that there's a few different preventive mechanisms when we talk about cervical cancer. Currently, we're doing something called HPV testing along with pap smears. And so that's, again, a relatively recent development where women during their normal kind of annual exams with their OBGYN will go in and will get tested for HPV virus as well as a pap smear. But bottom line is you go in, you get tested with a pap smear / HPV test for the most part, and the doctor will be able to tell you whether or not you are positive on either front.
And then once you find out that you have been positively diagnosed, then what? How do you treat it?
So if you're HPV positive and your pap smear is abnormal, then there's just kind of a sequence of events that will transpire from that point forward, starting with most likely something called a colposcopy, where they just go in with a higher magnification. They test to see if there's any precancerous lesions, because like I said earlier, HPV is very slow and has a very kind of linear march. And so we're seeing, okay, well, now it's there. Has it done anything? Is there precancer? And if we can actually go in with a pap smear during our exam and actually see any frank cancer, then we're at even greater of a stage or higher of a stage. And so it's just one step after another that really depends on where the woman is in the process of cancer development. If the colposcopy is negative, then you're just watched a bit closer. So if you're annually going in, then you'd probably be going in twice a year. Again, all of these are kind of dependent on the woman's age, the stage, what they're found, what type of HPV, is it high grade, is it low grade? All of those sorts of things kind of play into it.
I see. And one last quick question for you. Actually, I have two more quick questions. One of which is, you mentioned the vaccine as a prophylactic against some strains of HPV, protected sexual intercourse. Is that also, does that work? Is it effective?
So one of going back to that controversy, what we talk about in terms of dealing with, parents' kind of fear and confusion over this vaccine is that ideally, in an ideal world, everyone is abstinent until they're married, right? If that's kind of the strain of thought that we have, it's just not true, right? And same thing goes with protective measures. Ideally, yes, the barrier methods and such will protect, but it's not absolute. And so in those moments when, we can't really predict people's behaviors and such, that's why, barrier is great, but it's not something that we can rely on with 100% kind of confidence.
Doctor, with just 20 seconds left, can men get tested for HPV, and do they ever show symptoms?
Unfortunately, no. men are, that's just not standard. And again, one of the reasons that women don't get tested until their 20s usually is because it's so common. What are you going to do with the 80% plus of people who have HPV? A very small percentage of who go on to get cancer. So it's kind of useless to be testing kind of willy-nilly.
Doctor, you have enlightened us with so much information. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I really appreciate your interest.
And wear teal.
Yes, please wear teal in the month of January and start the dialogue. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. We're back after this.